time. So we proceed immediately then to the Health and Criminal Justice COVID-19 Amendment Bill from the Seanad. When last dealing with this particular matter, Deputy Thomas Pringle was in possession and he had 18 minutes remaining in his slot.
Thanks very much, Ceann Comhairle, and I'll continue on from where we were yesterday when we were interrupted. So I was just talking about the letters that we've been receiving over the last number of weeks from people, and I don't believe that these are conspiracy theorists or anti-vaxxers or COVID hoaxers or anything either. And I think some of their arguments do have some basis in reality, and they are that it has caused an unacceptable level of collateral damage and suffering, including in relation to physical and mental health, loneliness and isolation, increased domestic violence and livelihoods of many people. Public opinion is moving rapidly against a continuing lockdown, which Part 3 enables, with a Cantor Sunday Opinion poll finding huge frustration with the level of COVID restrictions, and 50% believe the lifting of restrictions is too slow. Human rights and civil liberties must be respected even when this is difficult, noting that a liberal democratic society does not abandon its commitment to human rights and civil liberties as soon as that commitment becomes inconvenient. And lockdowns are not a normal pandemic response, and in fact represent a radical departure from normal practice in responding to pandemics. And the original rationale for the restrictions to flatten the curve has long since passed. It is difficult to argue with some of these points. The Irish Council for Civil Liberties introduced and circulated an analysis on the renewal of the emergency COVID-19 powers earlier this month. And I note that the Seanad began the debate on this bill at the start of this week, and it is again being rushed through. Tuesday was the committee on final stages of the bill in the Seanad before it came to us. And I would like to acknowledge the work of some of the senators, particularly those in the Civic Engagement Group, who put forward detailed and proportionate amendments. And I agree that it is unacceptable to create provisions for a rolling 3-month renewal of this legislation. There are growing concerns about the spread of a new variant in England and the efficacy of the vaccines against this new variant. And none of us know what is coming and what could happen next, but we do have 15 months of experience. And the jury is still out, I think, on the effectiveness of what the English have done in terms of the vaccine programme, because the variants can run riot in a half-vaccinated population. And I would like to reiterate my support for public health measures and for the need for some emergency measures. Again, at the beginning of the pandemic, we didn't know what was going to happen and what we were going to do. But I wouldn't just pander to the government because of public health concerns. I have had public health concerns for those working in meat packaging factories, and I still have concerns for those in overcrowded and congregated settings, such as in direct provision. The ICCL has called for a meaningful and robust debate on the extension of the COVID-19 legislative measures. Senators were not given time for a meaningful and robust debate, and I note, however, that the Minister said that while addressing the Committee on Finance stages in the Seanad on Tuesday, that he would look at bringing an amendment to the Dáil Committee stage for just one 5-month extension. And that decision followed the debate in the Seanad on Monday and the concerns that were raised there, and I look forward to seeing that amendment. As mentioned, the ICCL analysis asked for a meaningful and publicly demonstrated proportionality test, for better consultation with the Irish Human Rights and Equality Commission, and for pre-legislative scrutiny, for Oireachtas approval to limit broad powers, and for a regular review of powers extended to Gardaí and ministers, and for a human rights impact assessment. It is an excellent and measured analysis, and I would like to thank the ICCL for consistently providing much-needed analysis to our Oireachtas members. I agree with the ICCL's points that enforcing public health should be based on education and advice. They pointed to behavioural science research that said positive reinforcement of messaging, targeted communication and provision of supports would ensure compliance, capability, opportunity and motivation at a higher rate than the threat of punishment. An example of this was the Garda hotline set up in Donegal for people to report others for breaching restrictions recently. The hotline was discontinued very soon after launching because it was never going to work in the first place, and that is not the way to motivate the public. The Health and Criminal Justice COVID-19 Bill, what a name for a piece of legislation. There's much that needs to be improved in our health service and also in our criminal justice service. Some of the facts and figures available on the Irish Penal Reform Trust website about the prison population across Ireland include There are 3,831 people in present custody in Ireland. The rate of imprisonment in Ireland is approximately 73 per 100,000 of the general population. The overall daily average number of prisoners in custody in 2019 was 3,971 compared to 3,893 in 2018. That's an increase of 2%. The majority of Irish prisoners have never sat a state exam, and over half have left school before the age of 15. The average number of females in custody in 2019 was 170, a 3% increase on the 2018 average of 165. The daily average number of female offenders in custody rose by 29% in the 10-year period between 2006 and 2016. As of October 2020, there were 47 people in prison slopping out without in-cell sanitation, and the list goes on. The figures here for the restricted regime do not include the Covid-19 infection control measures. The prison service worked very well in keeping Covid out of prisons, but it meant that most people were on restricted regimes of long lock-up. Think about these facts and figures. Though they give an insight into the much bigger problems in our criminal justice system, a huge increase in women prisoners, most likely to be from deprived areas, a big increase in those not paying fines, and this extends further to our policing of marginalised communities in deprived areas. On the Garda Síochána website, the statistics under Covid-related fines, there are some categories separated out under fine offenders. 74% of those fined are male, 53% are in the 18 to 25 age group, 24% in the 26 to 35 age group, and most of the fines were given out on Saturdays and Sundays. And the southern region has the highest number of fines issued at 6,157. Cork City and Limerick being the areas with the highest number of fines in that region. There have been over 886 fines given out in Donegal out of 5,013 in the northwestern region. There are better ways to go about things, and increasing Garda powers is not one, I believe, especially not until unconscious bias training has taken place and is implemented across the force. I said months ago that it would be interesting to see the level of policing in different postcodes and the likelihood of those getting away with breaching restrictions depending on their address or socioeconomic status. It is nearly a year since I started calling for a zero COVID strategy, instead of a stop-start disaster that has been the modus operandi of the government. Since Fine Gael handed over the Department of Taoiseach and Department of Health over to Fianna Fáil, it feels like Leo, Harris and co have been sitting back, rubbing their hands with glee and watching Fianna Fáil internally combust. The public has lost confidence in the government's handling of the pandemic. And yes, pandemic fatigue is a thing, but when the Minister for Health starts comparing the dangers to road safety and stuff like that to an unprecedented airborne global pandemic, people start to take things less seriously. I don't agree with the extra powers being extended for the Guardian, and I definitely don't agree with unlimited powers being extended to the government. And that's the reality of the situation. Thank you.
Deputy Collins.
Thank you, Ceann Comhairle. I'd like to welcome the opportunity to speak on the Health and Criminal Justice COVID-19 Amendment Bill. And what this bill is doing is continuing the extraordinary emergency legislation due to expire on the 9th of June, and you're bringing it up to the 9th of November 2021. And it may be further extended for up to 3 months at a time by a resolution passed by each House of the Oireachtas. These measures, Minister, as we know, are the health preservation and protection and other emergency measures in the Public Interest Act. It's also Section 1 of the Emergency Measures in the Public Interest Act 2020. It's Section 17 of the Criminal Justice Enforcement Powers 2020 and Section 6 of the Health Amendment Act 2020. Now, these extraordinary draconian pieces of legislation were brought in as we watched what was happening across the sea and across the country in Italy, where hospitals were coming overflowed with people, and they couldn't cope with the amount of people becoming ill and the rate of deaths. And we were seeing hospitals getting built in China to cater for the sick and the dying as well. We were dealing with an unknown virus and that we didn't know how it infected, really how it infected, whether it was airborne only or on surfaces. We had people wiping down their shopping as it came in the door, and we had people wiping the handles of their doors in their homes in relation to, because we were very fearful of what of contacting this virus. It went against all my political principles and instinct to give more power to the state to curtail people's freedoms and human rights. And I think that can be said of a lot of public reps in the Dáil and Shannon. So this debate is about extending this legislation, and is there a basis for the legislation to remain, particularly now that the vaccination programme has proven that it's been very effective in stopping the rate of infection, it appears to be stopping people getting infected and being passed on. We don't have that, obviously, peer review information from Israel. The recent reports are that it does seem to be not passing on to other people once you have the vaccine, but I suppose that's over a period of time that had to be reviewed. It's stopping people getting ill, and it's stopping people from dying with the virus. With the virus, it's absolutely fantastic that science could develop these vaccines, and the speed they did it, just absolutely brilliant. In saying that, it appalls me that these pharmaceutical companies have resisted, along with some of the key nations that have actually grabbed all the vaccines practically in the world. That's with Europe, Canada, US, up to recently, they've changed their position to temporarily waive the intellectual property rights for the vaccines and share the know-how and technology and the ingredients to enable greater manufacturing of vaccines all over the world. I think the position that we've adopted and not pushing Europe to support the TRIPS waiver is showing the illogical thinking and illogical actions of some of the decisions this government have made. Because we cannot, while I welcome everybody getting the vaccine in Ireland, we cannot be comfortable or smug from the point of view of knowing that 2/3 of the world's population won't probably get this vaccine until 2022 or early 2023 by continuing the way the vaccine has been distributed all over the world. And once that type of population hasn't been vaccinated, the potential for future variations, more dangerous variations, is there. And this is one of the reasons why I think we should be urgently, as a nation, be urging our government to support the TRIPS waiver and get the vaccine manufactured as quick as possible throughout the world to protect everybody. Just in relation to the information to date is that in relation to the Indian variant, the B1617, the information to date is that it decreased the effectiveness of the vaccines, particularly those with the first doses of the AstraZeneca and Pfizer. Considering that many 60 to 70-year-olds and 50 to 59-year-olds and people in cohort 4, that's very high risk, and cohort 7 received the AstraZeneca vaccine, and are waiting for their second dose, which gives people more protection against the B1617 Indian variant. I think we have to be cautious. We don't know the impact of this variant in relation to its impact on health and public health. I personally know somebody who has CF who won't be getting their second dose until mid-June. Over 60, 69-year-olds, many won't be getting their second vaccine until June and July as well. And these are the people who are most vulnerable and the ones that we want to protect more. So I think we really do have to move on with caution in relation to this. For the moment, Britain has 73% of the first dose in people's arms and 35% of the second dose. Northern Ireland are now vaccinating their 18-year-olds and over. And because of that threat of the Indian variant has shortened the window between England have shortened the window between the first and second dose of AstraZeneca from 12 to 8 weeks. Now, I listened to you this morning, Minister, in relation to saying it's supply, and it looks like that information we got, that we probably won't be getting the 600,000 of the Johnson & Johnson, possibly only 60,000, is a blow, I think, from the point of view of the vaccination programme. In the British Medical Journal, public health experts have said that the Indian variant has fundamentally changed the risk that they face in their country. So I think we have to take on board what they're saying. And learn from how they're responding and the information that they have. I think in Ireland here on the 15th of May there was 41 cases of the Indian variant. On the 21st, on the midweek of following the 15th of May, there was 59 cases, and on the 21st of May, there are 72 cases. Now, they're the ones that we know of. We don't know if there's more of that variant in the population. So I think we have to really, and I really urge the Minister to go back to NIAC, talk to them about if there's a case for shortening that 12-week. I know we've gone from 16 to 12, but to shorten that again, if we can, down to 8 weeks, because I think we're leaving, if the Indian variant is as infectious and the protection of the first dose is down to 30%, we have to protect those over the next period of time so that we won't see a situation where the virus can develop. I just look at the time there. In relation to the situation in relation to our history, and I know this is about the legislation, but I think when I heard one of the deputies saying that we handled it well, I don't think we did. I think we have a lot of questions and a lot of lessons to learn in relation to it. In the first restriction, where there's huge community support and backup in towns and villages and cities all over the country, we had the opportunity to reach zero COVID. When we came out of that first restriction, we were down very, very low numbers. The government didn't take the advice of NEFID in bringing in the mandatory hotel quarantine. We then had a situation, we didn't handle our nursing homes well, we didn't handle our direct provision centres well, and we continued to allow people travel even though they were fined a penalty if they were outside their 5 kilometre, 20 kilometre zone, but people continued to travel. Then we got the Spanish variant, and then we got the Kent variant. And now the Indian variant is within our community at the moment. But the Kent variant, I heard you saying earlier, Minister, that we would have gotten the Kent variant anyway. But if we'd had mandatory hotel quarantine in place from much earlier, that the idea of travelling to the country wouldn't be on the radar of an awful lot of people that did come with our so-called meaningful Christmas. And I think that would have had an impact on people actually travelling, even though they probably wouldn't have been, we wouldn't have known about the Kent variant, but they would have questioned travelling in the meantime. So I'm just going to make the last point that I think Deputy O'Crieve was right, that the people are ahead of the government on this. The people generally, when they see situations, dangerous situations looming, they do respond positively. And I do think that people are losing their trust in the government. And that's from the feedback I'm getting from people. And many of those emails we're getting, I do think are genuine. Some of them are genuine concerns, some of them are not. And I don't think we should be basing ourselves on that. But I think we should be taking note that people are getting frustrated, and they are getting. They want to know, Minister, and they want transparency and everything, and they want to be explained, because once it's logically explained why we're taking a certain position, people will follow. People will see that as a logical conclusion and will support it. So, and also we have an amendment down to review this on the 9th of September rather than November.
Thank you very much, Deputy. Now the next slot is a government slot. Deputy Jill O'Callaghan is not here, but Deputy Joe Flaherty is. So, Deputy Flaherty, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Ken Corla. And obviously nobody likes rules, nobody likes regulations, and nobody likes any measures that impact on our ability to live our lives as we please. And to that end, it's understandable that there is some resistance to the planned extension of the Health and Criminal Justice Bill. We have a very light touch policing policy here in Ireland, and that was reflected in the very professional manner in which An Garda Síochána dealt with our public health crisis crisis over the past 15 months. I think there's almost unanimity in the House on the extension of the legislation to later this year, but equally it is important that the public know and realise that we may not need the full complement of public health measures that have been in use over the past year ever again. It's also important that we have that safety valve there to call in these statutory measures again if necessary. It may also be the case that there could be some need for local and regionalised restrictions to control outbreaks over the coming months, but again we hope that that will not be the case. It's very easy and popular to be critical of the legislation. No self-respecting government would ever consider such legislation, and we only did so against the backdrop of 2,500 deaths, heartbroken families and many devastated business sectors. It's getting very hard to keep track of the emerging variants, as many speakers have already alluded to, and I think we're particularly conscious of the challenges faced at the moment by the people of India, and we can doubtlessly expect further strains to emerge over the coming months, and we need to be prepared for them and have the capacity to deal with them as they arise. I would have spoken earlier today and noted that we have now gone 12 days without a COVID-related death, and it is a trend that we wish to see continue. We are now on the cusp of seeing 50% of the population receive their first vaccine, and that's an important landmark on our road to recovery. We have surely travelled a long journey together since I first voiced concerns and reservations about the vaccine rollout back in March. Again, Minister for Health, I take this opportunity and will make no apologies for doing so to commend you on the success of the vaccine programme to date, and there is no doubt that its success rests with you and the national vaccination team. We have come a long way, but we're not there yet, and whilst the current situation gives great reason for hope, we do need to retain the necessary capability to react to any adverse developments, and this legislation provides that capacity for a time-specific 5-month period. I'm relatively new to this House and never imagined that in my time in this House I would see this legislation or indeed anything similar. I earnestly hope that no Irish government will ever again have to invoke such extraordinary powers which surely run contrary to the very spirit of this great nation. I accept that the powers are draconian. We asked people to stay in their homes, told them they could not go to work, told them they could not visit relations and family in hospitals or nursing homes, and told them no weddings and only very limited numbers at funerals. And we told their children that they couldn't go to school. I know it wasn't legislation that you, Minister, wanted to invoke, and whilst hindsight and history may say that mistakes were made, I do believe that this government has performed well in the face of a public health crisis. We rolled out the largest ever vaccine programme in the nation's history and can now rightly see an end in sight to this crisis. The original legislation was for 8 months and was then extended for a further 7 months, and the Minister is before the House today seeking a further 5-month extension with a 3-month sunset clause. It will provide the background that will allow us further unwind the restrictions that have paralysed this country for the past 14 months. Before Christmas, I would have been bullish and would have pushed for the fast-tracking of the reopening of our economy. We did so on a limited basis for Christmas, and ultimately it came at a price, and I concede to that point here today. This legislation is a safety net, and it will not deny this government the right to ease restrictions for hospitality, aviation, sport and the arts, arguably the last 4 sections of our commercial and social setup that are caught in the crushing arms of this crisis. And I do look forward to the Taoiseach's statement on the same tomorrow. I reluctantly agree to the extension, but do so in the certain knowledge that this extension is purely a safety valve to protect this nation and our great people. And I also do so in the hope and in the expectation that we will never ever again need this or similar legislation in this country. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Deputy Flaherty. Is there any other member offering? Deputy Stanton.
Thanks, Ceann Comhairle, and I rise today to contribute to this Health and Criminal Justice COVID-19 Amendment Bill 2021. First of all, I want to just say to the Minister who's here present that being Minister for Health at any time is a tough job. We all know that. being landed with COVID-19 global pandemic on top of that is not easy, to say the least. Being asked to look after a vaccine rollout of an unprecedented scale was challenging. Having to take charge of a quarantine regime was rather unsettling, to say the least, I'd say, and demanding. And then on top of that, having the HSE and the department experience the hacking situation of the last while, I think was the coup de grace, was the actual icing on the cake. So, Minister, to deal with all those issues, as you have done, I want to take my hat off to you and say well done. And I did mention to you privately in the past to look after yourself, because the amount of stuff that you're dealing with and the stress and strain is enormous. And I want to pay tribute to you and the work you've done, and your team as well, in the HSE and in the department. Now, just that brings me to the healthcare workers, Ceann Comhairle, and again we've all been speaking on and off about how the stress they've been under. And I've spoken to a few of them, some young doctors in particular, who were absolutely shattered and exhausted when the pandemic actually was at its height, and who were dealing with people and who were dying, who were on the verge of dying, trying to keep people alive, working all day in PPE gear and having very long shifts and very long hours. And that's very extremely challenging. And again, I think we all have to appreciate the work they did. And also the work the Garda Síochána did, as was alluded by the last speaker here, in meeting people out in the streets and on the roads and dealing with people in a civilised and in a disciplined and in a cooperative way in trying to curtail the spread of the virus at the time. We must also recognise the impact it has had on children and young people. I think I heard one particular guy on television saying at one stage that young people in their teens and early 20s are programmed to socialise, and of course they couldn't socialise at all, and again older people as well. So it has been a really, really tough time. Today, Ceann Comhairle, we're dealing with 4 pieces of legislation: the Health Preservation and Protection and Other Emergencies in the Public Interest Act 2020, Part 3 of that, Part 5 of the Emergency Measures in the Public Interest COVID-19 Act 2020, the Criminal Justice Enforcement Powers COVID-19 Act 2020, and the Health Amendment Act 2020, which were all enacted as temporary measures and were time limited, and rightly so. In the explanatory memorandum that the Minister has kindly circulated to us, there is a sentence here which is slightly concerning, and I quote, "It is in this context," and he talks about the trajectory of the disease and so on, and the spread of it and variants and so on. "It is in this context that the emergency provisions in the 4 named acts aimed at preventing and minimising the spread of COVID-19 will still be required in the near future and should therefore be continued in force." Now, we hope to God, all of us, that they will not be required in the near future. But I would suggest maybe if that had read "may still be required," it might be better. We all hope that it won't be. I just want to say that as a lot of colleagues on all sides here have said, that this is extraordinary legislation, which gives the Minister and the Government extraordinary powers. I was taken very much by what Deputy Richard Bruton said in his contribution earlier, where he alluded to that. And I think myself that extending this to November 2021 is a long way away. It's a huge distance, and I just wonder why that date was picked. And then with a provision of 3 months after that, which brings us up to sometime in January or February, which again is over the Christmas period. Maybe that's the reason. But could I suggest to the Minister that he might consider extending this to September and have an Oireachtas committee examine this before the Dáil returns in the autumn, and then have another debate on it at that stage and see where we're going. Now, we're all getting emails from constituents and from citizens out there who are very, very concerned about the powers that the state has. Powers to require people to remain in their homes. And that's an extraordinary power. Powers to prevent private events and different types of events and so on, and powers of arrest and so on. Now, a lot of these were necessary, and actually it was strange because before the powers were in place at all, we had regulations and we had guidelines, and those were followed by the people at the start because people were worried and afraid. And wanted to comply and didn't want this thing to spread. There was a huge amount of fear at the very start of this when this thing broke. When people saw images on their screens of patients in Italy and other parts of the world being treated in emergency rooms and which were overflowing. So could I suggest that the Minister might consider extending this to September and not November? And he might tell us in his summary on why November was picked. And again, as a previous speaker said, we may not need, hopefully we'll not need the full complement of powers here. So there might be a need for further amendment in that regard. The actual amount of legislation that was passed in 2020, and I want to pay tribute to the officials who drafted the legislation, the Parliamentary Council, the Attorney General's Office and so on, who were involved in drafting this. Those, and I know myself from being there, those 4 pieces of legislation took an immense amount of work to put together without making serious mistakes. An enormous amount of work. So there must have been a lot of midnight oil burned. But they were supposed to be temporary. And I noticed there today that the HSE have reported, and I quote, a collapse in the number of deaths. Thankfully, we're there. That's not to say that we should bear in mind the 4,841 people who did die and of COVID. Now, there are people out there, Count Corla, who feel that all this is some kind of a global hoax, that it's a power grab by the WHO and others to subjugate the world, that Bill Gates is somehow or another involved. We've all seen those conspiracy theories. And there are people who are really concerned about the powers the Minister has, and who are concerned about, as they see it, the curtailment of various freedoms that they should have in a democracy and would have, and we all want them to have. So I think we need to explain further why we need these powers extended. And I think we also need to look at to have a bit more flexibility with respect to the application of some of these powers. I have said in the past, Count Cora, that we need maybe a one-stop shop sometimes to find out, to look for exemptions. For instance, I know, for instance, of doctors who wanted to come from abroad from Ireland to work as locums, and they are now expected to quarantine in a hotel for 2 weeks at their own expense. Now, maybe the Minister might take that on board, or his officials who are hopefully listening, and see can anything be done in that regard. Maybe that might not be required. It's already been spoken about the whole issue of hotel quarantine in the last debate, and I just want to, Count Crawley, put on the record my concern about the aviation industry as well. And, you know, if we lose it, it could be gone, and it might be a long time before we get it back. And again, I'd like maybe some clarity from the Minister with regard to travel from the USA and Canada in particular. Can people travel to Ireland from the USA and Canada? What's required? Will they have to have a certificate? What kind of certificates are actually recognised here, if any? And what kind of quarantine would be required if they come here? Would they have to quarantine for 5 days in a home or in a hotel? Because I think we need to start looking at trying to open up international travel again as soon as possible. I noticed as well there are 4 pieces of legislation, and they all kind of sound a bit similar, but they're all a bit different as well. The other one that's mentioned, the Emergency Measures in the Public Interest COVID Act, and we are actually talking about extending the mental health provisions in there. But there's also a provision with regard to the Residential Tenancies Act 2004, which is Part 2. Now, that hasn't been mentioned. Maybe the Minister might comment on that when he speaks later on. In Section 17 of the Criminal Justice Enforcement Powers Act, which has also been extended, that gives the guards power to enter premises and inspect premises. And then Section 4 of that bill gives them power to shut down premises. Now we've heard reports of shebeens and things operating around the country and so on during this period, and the guards have done the best they can and I must salute the inventors and the publicans who have also complied with the legislation and the regulations in the main. Very, 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 very few, less than a handful that I know of, haven't, and they're to be commended. But we do need to support them as they open up as best we can. And we do need to look at small businesses as well, because there will be, to use that old saying, unknown unknowns, when businesses open up and they find that their business is actually gone. That, I think someone used the phrase this morning, zombie businesses, and we've got to look at that as well as they start opening up. That maybe is for another time. It's good to see that the vaccines are being rolled out. It's good to see that the vaccines are working, which is hugely important. And I think we all now are looking for a vaccine benefit in that we get more and more freedoms because of that. So I just want to, Count Corla, finish at that. I want to thank the Minister for the work he's done and his team. It has been very, very challenging in everybody, but I think now hopefully we can move forward with a certain amount of confidence into the future and get our economy open again and get back to as normal as near as we can. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Deputy Stanton. If there's no other member offering, then I got Deputy Marian Harkin.
Thank you, Can Corla. I'm up here in the gods. Minister, I, like a lot of other deputies, have some real concerns about the proposed amendments. We are, as Deputy Stanton just told us, looking in fact at 4 amendments, 2 on health, 1 on emergency measures in the public interest, and 1 on criminal justice enforcement powers. Now, these amendments were put in place to deal with an emergency situation, and as the nature of the emergency has changed since we first put them in place, I think we have to take account of that when we are discussing these proposals. Up to now, Minister, I voted with the government in supporting this legislation and in rolling it over. I had concerns, but I did feel it was a measured response. But legislation like this, and I suppose any legislation, but especially emergency legislation that gives significant powers, unprecedented powers, to law enforcement, to medical officers, and indeed to you, Minister, to make specific regulations, has to be very closely examined. I think we would be failing in our duty as TDs if we did not do that. Now, as I said, I believe this legislation got the balance right last year and last January, but circumstances have changed considerably since then. In other words, we got the balance right, but the balance has shifted. And the legislation before us doesn't reflect that shift in the balance. The vaccine rollout, as we know, has been successful, and there were many in this House, time and time again, who questioned your ability, the ability of government, of the HSE to deliver. I wasn't one of those, because I genuinely believed that everybody would do their very best and that you were well competent to do so. And that means approximately 50% of the population are now vaccinated. I know that means 50% are not vaccinated, but those who are vaccinated are those who are most at risk of hospitalisation and dying because they have contracted COVID. So, despite the hugely disappointing news this morning regarding the Janssen vaccine, our rollout is still proceeding. And when you brought this legislation, this draft legislation to the House, the target of 80% of the population receiving a first dose by the end of June, and I think it was around 55%, correct me if I'm wrong, but it's not far out, excuse me, receiving a second dose, that was in place. But Minister, that's a totally different context to last January, when less than 10% had been vaccinated. And in that context, our response needs to reflect that. In fact, I agree with Deputy Richard Bruton when he says we should actually be looking at unwinding these powers instead of just simply rolling them over. Now, my colleague Michael McNamara will bring forward an amendment, because last March, Minister, we gave you, when this legislation was put in place, not last March, we gave you unprecedented power to bring in specific regulations, increasing restrictions. Now, we are rolling over the legislation to give you the power to do that again. And I believe that the specific regulations should come before the law. I think we have to be able to debate the specific regulation rather than just the legislation that enables you to do that. We have an oversight role here. People outside don't often see it maybe as that important until it affects their lives. But when it does, they realise just how important it is. And it's incumbent on us as TDs to ensure that that oversight is there and that you are held to account. So in that context, I would also support the Sinn Féin amendment to bring the date back to the 9th of July. It's close, but what it does is it gives this House control, and that's crucial. And Minister, I've no doubt, if you were on the opposition benches and a minister was bringing in this kind of legislation which gives him or her unprecedented power to make these regulations, you would have concerns also. November 9th as an end date is not reasonable. It's far too far away. It's not proportionate, and it doesn't strike a proper balance between public health and civil liberties. Now, as I said, I can live with a constraint on civil liberties in the middle of a pandemic because we have to balance that with public health. But we are emerging from the pandemic, slowly, but we're emerging. So we're in a different space, and that requires a different approach. I think it's also important to say that this legislation amends social welfare acts. So if a person is diagnosed with COVID and they're sick, or if they have to self-isolate, then they have to continue to have an entitlement to illness benefit, and also in regard to job seekers benefit and job seekers allowance. And these need to be rolled over. So it presents us in the opposition with a horrible choice. Because we know these must be rolled over, but we have serious concerns about some of the other aspects of the legislation. And it's no choice at all, Minister, because people have to be protected, but to some extent, what we're doing here is we're protecting people from themselves when there is no need to do that anymore. And to me, that's a serious issue. So those protections around job seekers and illness benefit need to be rolled over, but the others need to be nuanced. And Minister, I think you can improve this legislation by taking some of the proposed amendments. I think they'll help to provide the necessary safeguards. I think the proportionate legislative framework for the current circumstances is what we would emerge with. And not just the current circumstances, but that for the near future. Can Corla, have I 10 or 20 minutes, can I ask, please? Okay. I've been flying, but I won't take it. That doesn't matter. Anyway, the other issue is the rolling sunset clauses. I mean, they're not acceptable now. Minister, I've listened to a good bit of this debate, but I didn't catch it all. And I think I might have heard somewhere that perhaps you're willing to amend that wording. I'm not sure, and I hope you are. But in truth, it tells us a great deal about the mindset of those drafting the legislation and those who approved the legislation, that they remained in the legislation, in the draft legislation. But I'll be listening carefully to hear what you have to say on that. Now, Minister, on a related note, and I suppose a very much related note, the announcements that we are expecting tomorrow. Can I please ask that we get simplicity and clarity around the guidelines? I have just argued for nuance in legislation, because that's where it's appropriate. But when it comes to guidelines, we need simplicity and clarity. And for example, Minister, when I hear of the possibility that we have different guidelines around tables that are 1 metre apart and tables that are 2 metre apart, to be honest, I lose the will to live. I understand where it comes from, the abundance of caution and trying to manage things. But, Minister, what happens if somebody pushes their chair back a little bit? The 2 metres is now 1.7 metres. You know, are they breaking the law? Is the owner of the restaurant or the hotel breaking the law? Is somebody going to take out a measuring tape and measure the distance? I mean, this type of guideline is unenforceable. We all know that. And it brings the law into disrepute. And people who have followed guidelines to the letter, and, Minister, who want to follow guidelines to the letter, will start to ignore them. And if we make it simple and we make it clear, then it's much easier for people to follow. And I'm not making up this story. This actually happened today. I was speaking to somebody on the phone, just a general conversation, not a constituent, and they were talking to me about families not being able to dine together. And I said, hold on, they are. There's, you know, an allowance that if there's children and adults, it's a different number. Now, this person watches the news, reads the newspapers, but they actually were confused about it. And to be honest, unless we have very simple guidelines that everyone can understand, a lot of people will be in this situation. So, Minister, I'm not telling you or NEFIT or NIAC or anybody else what decisions to make, but I'm saying this: make your decisions. Tell us what the distance is, one distance. Tell us the numbers, not a series of numbers, and then let people get on with it. And, Minister, the possibility that there could be time limits on dining, let the owners of hotels and restaurants decide that. This is not something that should be decided centrally, and I just hope it won't be. And also, Minister, if hotels can open up, if they can open up their restaurants, then all restaurants should be able to open up. As I said, give us the rules, make them simple and straightforward, and then it's much easier to comply. One or two final points. The green card. I've heard, and please tell me I'm wrong, it was just on the grapevine, that while of course member states have flexibility about this, about when they introduce it and how they introduce it, etc., I have heard that there's a possibility that we may pick and choose. I mean, there are three things. If you have been vaccinated, if you have recovered from COVID, or if you have a negative test, then you should be able to access this green cert. I've heard rumours that we may pick and choose, and perhaps it's only those who are vaccinated who can access this cert. Minister, I think that would be devastating for the aviation industry. It's only speculation, and I hope it's not right, but yesterday I spoke of the importance of the aviation industry, of the importance of Shannon Airport, of the transatlantic connection to the whole West Coast. I'm from the northwest Sligo, but I still recognise the value and the importance of that service. And our aviation industry is on its knees. So when we introduce the green cert, Minister, make sure, please, I'm asking you, that it's in conformity as much as we can with our European neighbours. But please don't pick and choose as to one or the other. So, Minister, can I finally say that I believe, by and large, this government has done a reasonable job on COVID. I mean, it's a global pandemic. There's no rules. They weren't written beforehand. And even when it's over, those rules can still change because you can't negotiate with the virus. So it's easy to be wise after the fact. And in my view, those who have to make the decisions beforehand have the really tough job. And they have to stand or fall on those decisions. And as I said, I think you've done a reasonable job, the government have done a reasonable job in extraordinary circumstances and in completely unforeseen circumstances. But my final word is that in the context of today's legislation, what we're discussing here, the time frame is too long. We should be looking at unwinding rather than rolling over. And I hope that when we discuss this at committee stage, Minister, you will look at taking on board some of the amendments that are proposed, because I genuinely believe that they will improve this legislation, and I think that's what every one of us in this House wants to see. Thank you.
You, Deputy Harkin. Minister, would you like to respond to the debate?
Gurmagath Cian Corla, and can I thank Deputy Harkin and everybody else who's contributed. It's been a very worthwhile debate, I think a very thoughtful, reflective and important debate as we discuss these exceptional times and the legislation and the public health measures and powers that have been put in place to respond to this pandemic. I don't have a closing speech. What I wanted to do instead was try to capture the various comments, questions and themes raised by colleagues around the House. So I'll run through them as best I can, Cian Corla, and inevitably there will be some I have missed, and I apologise ahead of time for those. Can I start by just reiterating that nobody wants this bill. I don't want this bill. I don't want anyone to have to need these powers, even temporarily. And they don't sit easily with me, nor should they sit easily. I don't believe they would sit easily with anybody.
This is about the 5th time he said this, he doesn't want the bill. Why is he introducing it? He didn't want it in opposition, and he doesn't want it now, and he's introduced it. This is Cos Wallop.
Point of order, Deputy
Why is he introducing it? Just go, take it away.
It's not a point of order, Deputy McGrath. Please, the Minister now without interruption. The same applies to you, Deputy McNamara, please.
Thank you, Cian Corla. But nonetheless, the powers are necessary, and most of us in this chamber, notwithstanding Deputy McGrath and a few others, most of us in this chamber understand why we do need public health measures and why they have been very important in terms of saving lives, and why they do need a statutory basis to be brought in. One of the things I would like to say, Deputy Harkin referenced it. I think she's gone now, but Deputy Harkin referenced it, and oh, sorry, hi, I beg your pardon, and others did as well, which was that what we should be doing here is unwinding the measures and unwinding the powers, and that is exactly what we are doing. The bill before us doesn't seek to make any changes to having more comprehensive regulations or measures in place. All the bill seeks to do is to extend the ability for government to bring measures in. That's it. And while there is a lot of focus on the office holder of the Minister for Health and the powers that I currently in that office have, I'd just like to assure colleagues that really these are regulations which are introduced by government. There aren't regulations which I or we in healthcare are coming up with and signing into law and saying this is now a measure. The process by which this happens is that government meets and government considers measures, just like we're doing tomorrow. Tomorrow is another example. So this evening, after this session, there will be a COVID committee. There's been a lot of analysis done. NEFIT met yesterday. A lot of analysis and thinking has been done over the last few days and weeks. In the build-up to tomorrow's Cabinet meeting, there will be a memo provided to Cabinet which will propose to Cabinet that various measures are undertaken. And I imagine and hope and expect that when we meet tomorrow, it will be about the further unwinding of measures and the further relaxation of measures. And then what happens is that I and the Department of Health take those away, and we create the regulations in consultation with the AG's office and in consultation with other departments and ministers as appropriate. The regulations are then published, and the regulations are then brought into law. So I just want to assure colleagues that really these measures, whilst under statute, they're powers that whoever holds the office I currently hold bring in. Actually, the process really is about decisions government are making. There aren't other regulations being brought in without government decisions. And so back to Deputy Harkin's point around what we should be doing is unwinding measures. That really is what we're doing here. What we're doing is saying, in order to unwind the measures in a safe, sustainable way so that they don't just all disappear in one day, which is exactly what would happen, we need an extension of the bill or the Act to be able to do that. But as we move further and further through the summer, it is absolutely my expectation, and I think all of our expectation, that actually the regulations will become smaller and smaller and smaller and smaller. And that indeed it might be that by November, I very much hope it is that by November, there are no measures in place. And so one of the questions that was asked was, well why November? I know there's amendments tabled at committee stage around July. I think most people would accept that having the measures extend for just a few weeks really is not where we're at in terms of this disease. This disease is still very, very serious. We're still stuck in and around the 400 to 500 cases per day. That hasn't come down, whilst severe illness and fatality have. The number of cases is still quite high. And we are very concerned about the Indian variant and the impact it's had in parts of the UK. So I think most people would accept that we really do need measures for a while longer. Should it be September? Should it be October? Should it be November? I don't believe there's a right answer to that. However, we have from day one been public health led. And the public health view is that measures of some sort are likely to be needed through the autumn and early winter. So as an example, in September, it's all our hope that we will have schools returning and childcare returning and third level education returning in full on campus. That's what we all want to see happen. It could well be the case that the public health view at that time is that on third level campuses, for example, there may be cases where it is safe and prudent and cautious to begin by wearing face masks in certain settings. I have no idea if that will be what they recommend, but it's entirely possible that we will have variants like the Indian variant and other variants where public health, and it is their view that up until then, it is possible that public health measures will be required, however minimalist they may be, and hopefully will be. But to have those, you need to have the ability to make these regulations. And what I am doing is tomorrow I'm seeking government approval to make a very significant amendment to the bill. I read the submission from the ICCL, and I've listened very intently to colleagues in the House and listened very intently to the debate in the Seanad. And I agree with the point that has been made from a wide number of places that we shouldn't have the ability to simply roll the sunset clauses on again and again and again. And so I'm bringing forward, I'm seeking government agreement tomorrow to bring forward a series of amendments in Dáil committee stage, which would apply that only one sunset clause would be allowed, up to a maximum, it doesn't have to be 3 months, but up to a maximum of 3 months, and then the bill would fall. And I hope colleagues will support that. And I know colleagues have various measures in place in terms of different versions of that, in terms of timing. But I hope colleagues will support that and accept that this is the legislative process at work. You know, there has been comment that there hasn't been enough time for debate or oversight. We've spent many hours in second stage. We've been through second stage in the Shannon. We'll spend hours in committee stage, and through the legislative process, the bill is being amended in a very substantive way. And I just hope colleagues recognise that is oversight and that is the legislative process at work. With regards to oversight and transparency on the regulations themselves, some deputies have suggested that there has been very little of this, and on that I would respectfully disagree, and disagree quite fundamentally. There has been a vast amount, and continues to be a vast amount, of analysis done, available for discussion. The Health Committee and any of the sectoral committees can and do look at individual issues in their own sectors. They debate them. We've had debates in the House here, not every week, but many weeks. Members can always table private members' bills, private members' motions. There is a facility for any regulation to be debated in the Oireachtas and annulled within a certain number of days of it having been laid before the Houses. That mechanism hasn't been used by any deputies to any of the regulations that have been put in place. But I can certainly tell you, as somebody who.
I just invite maybe the Minister to correct the fact that there was a motion put before the House to annul. It was voted down by the Minister, and he corralled the sheep in behind him in the flock into the pen. But to say that it wasn't utilised is misleading the House.
It's not a point of order. Deputy McGrath.
Our group introduced the statutory instrument to declare null and void, and the Minister has said this before, and he accuses us of misstatements. He said this before and he was corrected, and he's in some kind of a cloud cuckoo land. It happened in this floor. We lost the vote, yes, but we put it down. The Taoiseach begged us not to put it down, but we did.
We'll all have to agree to disagree on this.
No. I mean, he can't mislead the House. This is the second time he's done it on this issue. He can't just have it both ways. Like he's in some kind of a euphoric state that he doesn't know what he's doing. He doesn't want to introduce this, but yet he is. But he's telling absolute porkies and lies. We had a motion here that Don Wicklow proved that. And so I'd ask him to correct the record now, please.
Please don't accuse a colleague of telling lies.
No, but I'd ask him to correct the record this minute. Well, because he did it before.
Can we go back to the Minister then?
Yes, and I'd ask him to correct the record. We introduced a statutory instrument, annulment of a statutory instrument here.
Let's hear the Minister out without interruption. Minister, please.
Thanks, Ken Corla. That's not a point of order. If that is incorrect, I'm more than happy to, if there was such a motion brought forward to annul a specific regulation, I'm more than happy to accept that. No problem whatsoever. I would point out, however, Ken Corla, that we all listened to the diatribe, quite frankly, from Deputy McGrath, but we listened nonetheless, and we didn't keep jumping up like a jack in the box and interrupting them. We do actually afford each other the space to make our points. So Deputy McGrath might consider the same. So Ken Corla, we've addressed the issue around Oireachtas oversight and transparency, and we've addressed the issue of dates and why the 9th of November is being suggested, and the substantive amendment that I hope to get government agreement for tomorrow. There were other issues raised as well around the Mental Health Commission and details on the Mental Health Commission, and I'm very happy to ask the Department to provide colleagues with a report as to how that has worked. The briefing I have is that there were, whilst the regulations allowed for tribunals to be held by a single psychiatrist rather than by the normal three, that didn't happen. That whilst they were held remotely, the three were in use. And it is my view, and it is the Mental Health Commission and the HSE's view, that we need to get back to in-person tribunals as quickly as possible. And I know that the HSE is in contact with the professional body and the professionals involved in these to bring that back as quickly as is possible. There was questions around the assessment of the regulations. There were questions around what sort of assessment is done before these regulations are brought in, and I can share with colleagues that there's a wide variety of assessments. So there's public health assessment, obviously. There's also social impact analysis and economic analysis done. That's considered by Cabinet. It's been considered typically by the COVID committee as well. And then the measures are brought in, and certainly the analysis from NEFIT and the advice from NEFIT is all available online. So the minutes of the NEFIT meetings are available. The analysis that NEFIT itself uses to consider, including, for example, the projections on epidemiology done by Professor Nolan's group, that's all available online as well, as indeed are the letters from the Chief Medical Officer to me in terms of his advice based on that analysis. So there is a lot of analysis available online. Somebody asked with regard to enforcement data if that could be published. My understanding is An Garda Síochána does publish the enforcement data as it pertains to the various offences. There were various other issues raised. One was around the ability for groups like the AA and other support groups for those in addiction to be able to meet up and for greater numbers to be accommodated. That's something that I'll certainly feed in. There were a lot of comments and a lot of debate, I think very useful debate, around human rights and the infringement on people's civil liberties that these regulations and these measures cause. And there's no question but that they do cause and have caused in very serious ways and with very serious consequences. As we know, there has been huge hardship, huge isolation, huge loneliness. A lot of people are dealing with their own mental health. Businesses have had to close. People have lost their livelihoods. People haven't been able to travel. They haven't been able to move far from where they live. People haven't been able to mourn their friends and family the way they normally would, attend weddings and celebrate the way they normally would. And I just want to assure colleagues these things are taken very seriously, and none of this is done lightly. And there is the other side of that as well, which is the right of people to be protected from the disease and the right of people to be able to live in a society where appropriate measures are put in place to keep everybody safe and to break the chains of transmission. And so it's a balance, and I don't think there's any way of ever getting that balance perfectly right, but we certainly try to get that balance right. And what colleagues will see is as the risk of the disease to individuals has increased at certain times, the measures have increased. And then as the risk of the disease decreases, as it is now, the measures applied decrease correspondingly and hopefully proportionately. Maybe not always. Maybe some measures should have been brought in earlier. Maybe some measures should have been gotten rid of earlier. But the effort has always been to be proportionate and to balance the measures against the risk to people's safety, the risk to people's lives, the risk to the healthcare system, and ultimately to public health to that end. And hopefully tomorrow there will be a very positive meeting and we will be able to further relax the measures insofar as possible. Just two final points, Ceann Comhairle. One is that whatever we may think about the measures are working. When you look at excess mortality rates in the European Union during the time of the pandemic, Ireland has one of the lowest rates of excess mortality. It's not to minimise what has happened and the pain and the suffering in terms of loss of life. I'm just saying when we compare ourselves to other countries of similar similar societal and economic makeups as ourselves, our excess mortality rate is low by those standards. We achieved one of the earliest reopening of schools, primary and secondary schools, in-person teaching this year in Europe as well, which was one of the priorities. We saw an enormous fall in cases from that very, very high peak in January down, which worked very well. We know that in the last 12 days there have been 8 fatalities reported linked to COVID. Again, it's 8 too many, but relative to what we've been dealing with, 8 fatalities in the last 12 days is a sign that the most severe impacts of this awful pandemic are being dealt with, partly by the vaccine programme, obviously, but also partly because people have backed the measures. And I know there are widely held views on which measures are right or which measures were not right. But the reason they worked was because broadly, I think people trusted the public health advice and complied with the measures to the best of their ability. And the result of that is that an awful lot of lives have been saved, and that we are in a positive position now in terms of a sustainable exit from the pandemic. And then finally, Ken Corla, I just want to take a moment to thank the Department of Health officials. We have quite rightly thanked, numerous times I have and many colleagues have, the HSE, our healthcare workers, and everybody who's been involved in this, in our national response. The Department of Health officials tended not to get so much thanks, but they've been working away in the background 7 days a week, all hours of the day. The department has had its entire normal workload of the healthcare system and the resumption of services and mandatory hotel quarantine and all of these measures and these incredibly complex regulations that have to be done and redone and redone, and all of the vaccine programme and testing, tracing and genome sequencing and all the other things we're aware of. And the department has done this with not a huge amount of additional resource. What has happened is the same people have worked 7 days a week, week after week after week after week. They started very early in the morning. I'm regularly talking to them at midnight. I just want to say, particularly in regard to these regulations, there is a vast amount of work goes into turning government decisions into workable and reasonable regulations and public health measures. And I just want to end by acknowledging the enormous work that the Department of Health have done and continue to do through this pandemic. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Minister. I suppose I should say on behalf of the House that while members here may disagree on approaches to be taken to particular measures, we all of us recognise the enormous contribution that all of you who have been involved in the battle against this pandemic, the enormous efforts that you have put in, the immeasurable hours and everything else that has been involved. So we acknowledge that and we thank everyone that has been involved. The motion that we must consider now, members, is that the bill be now read a second time. Is that agreed? Agreed. Not agreed. Okay. Na teachtaí tar hefn na taircina aberdís tá. Tá. Na teachtaí tá na gana aberdís níl. Stoilem Gullen Kestrich, I believe the question is carried. Vote all insofar as a vote has been called. It is postponed until the weekly division time, which I think will be next week. Thank you all very much for your cooperation on that matter.